Welcome to episode 14 of Quiltside Chats. Brought to you by American Quilt Study Group. The American Quilt Study Group establishes and promotes the highest standards for interdisciplinary quilt-related studies, providing opportunities for study, research, and the publication of works that advance the knowledge of quilts and related subjects. In partnership with the International Quilt Museum at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. The International Quilt Museum's mission is to build a global collection and audience that celebrate the cultural and artistic significance of quilts. Quiltside Chats are a series of lively conversations between Carolyn Ducey, International Quilt Museum Curator of Collections, and an American Quilt Study Group member featuring the quilt that she or he would sneak out of the building if it weren't a crime. Carol Butzke is a teacher, lecturer, researcher, quilt maker, certified appraiser, and a certified quilt judge. She began quilting in 1980 and has won numerous awards at national, state, and regional shows. During her 40-plus year career in quilts and textiles, she has served on numerous professional boards and panels. Her work has appeared in many books and magazines, and she was a guest on Sewing with Nancy in a 3-part series called Very Easy Vintage Quilts. She currently serves on the board of the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Arts as a collections representative, and she volunteers as a consultant for the museum's collections. Carol also currently serves as a program instructor and board member for the American Quilters Society Appraisal Certification Committee, and she is a member of the Professional Association of Appraisers of Quilted Textiles. Dr. Carolyn Ducey is Curator of Collections at the International Quilt Museum, a position she has held since 1998. She oversees acquisition and management of the IQM collection of more than 8,500 quilts. Ducey earned an MA in American Art History from Indiana University in 1998 and her PhD in Textiles, Clothing, and Design with an emphasis in quilt studies at the University of Nebraska in 2010. She is co-editor of American Quilts in the Industrial Age, 1760 to 1870, and co-author of What's in a Name? Inscribed Quilts. And now, let's cozy up to the quilt.
Hi, Carol. Hi, everybody. Welcome. What a beautiful Sunday it is here, at least in Nebraska. I don't know about you, Carol, but we're actually having kind of a mild, beautiful day. So it's so great to have you here. And gosh, thinking about those intros, we've been friends for a very long time now. We've been involved in all kinds of different projects.
We have indeed, and I do remember that it was before 2000, I think, when we first met. I was out judging the Nebraska State Fair and had an extra day, came over and helped you refold quilts, and I did that on a couple different occasions. And I think the quilt that I picked out, I may have seen on that day, and it stuck in my mind particularly. We can certainly go to the picture of that quilt, and it's called Painted Daisy.
Yeah, let's see the one you picked out. I love this little piece so much.
And so do I. It's just a very special quilt in my mind, and in its connections, it actually has a Wisconsin connection from where I am from, and I think that helps make it even a little closer to my heart. We'll refer back to this, but I also wanted to bring up, since we're talking about a baby quilt, pictures of you and I at one.
I love this. And I didn't plan my picture to be just the same as yours, Carol, but let's go to the baby pictures. These are
okay, we can go to that slide.
We have Molly with us today, and Molly's kind of new to our program. So she might be just struggling a minute to get to the next slide. I think Tara is off in Spain right now, so Tara's not with us. Oh, there we are. You could not have picked two better pictures, Carol. These are so great.
I think it's fun because there's certainly the painted daisy quilt is certainly a perfect quilt for a cute little girl like we were. It's a perfect quilt. It's delicate. It's well balanced design. We can go back to that picture if we'd like. Okay, that'll be there. That's great. Thank you. And it's delicate, well balanced, as I said, and exquisitely quilted. And its Wisconsin connection is through its origins through the Mary McElwain quilt shop, which was in Walworth, Wisconsin. I mean, really, what's not to like about this quilt? It was called in from the nice people at Lincoln to the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Arts when AQSG had their seminar in Milwaukee in 2014. The museum did an exhibit on Mary McElwain as a businesswoman and entrepreneur. And this quilt was one of three that the International Quilt Museum was kind enough to lend to us to the exhibit. Okay, we can go to the next pictures of the, there we go. Go ahead.
Call this then a kit? Was it sold as a kit? Or are you going to get in? Am I jumping?
I think I'm going to get into that a little bit later. We'll talk a little bit more about that. It is part of the artist and Robert James collection. The maker is unknown from the information you have from the museum, but it's possibly from Indiana. And it's a very small piece. It's 27.5 inches by 36.5 inches. And the colors are eggshell. It's not a white, and that's important to remember. Eggshell and pink, and probably was meant for a little girl. And it's quilted at somewhere between 12 and 16 stitches to the inch.
Oh, and the quilting is amazing.
It is. And those quilting designs were advocated by Mary McElwain, and we'll talk a little bit more about her and that. And you could purchase the quilt for $2, for a kit, I should say, for $2.75. And if you wanted the whole quilt completed, it was $7.50.
Now there's a deal. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, in light of today's expenses of just what a yard of fabric costs, it's kind of amazing. Okay, we can go to the next picture, please. Mary McElwain, as I said, she was an entrepreneur. She was a businesswoman. She had a shop in Walworth, Wisconsin from 1912 until her death in 1943. And the shop finally closed in 1960. The family had run it until that time. Now, we got to remember that this shop, which was very successful, was running through the Depression years. And it was also the era of the colonial revival style. And actually, she had a second shop, which was in St. Petersburg, Florida. And that was in a very upscale area. So you get an idea of the quality and expectations of what that shop was able to offer. And Mary, being the person she was also a designer of some quilts. She was a quilt judge. She was a wife. She was a mother. She even was a Sunday school superintendent. And we can go a picture to the next picture. She also was a judge for that infamous 1933 Chicago World's Fair Sears Quilt Contest. Now, in the picture, the lady on the left is Sue Roberts, which I understand was an extension homemaker position for Sears Company. The next lady is Ann Orr, and then the third lady from the left is Mary. And the lady on the right is a woman by the name of B. Burnett. I don't know her first name, but just the initials was B. Burnett.
And they're decked out for this judging, aren't they? They're in their Sunday best.
How often do we wear hats anymore, right? Okay, Mary was very particular about the quality of the products that came out of her shop. She only used Peter Pan quality fabrics, which was a high quality, closely woven fabric. Thread and batting she had, paper patterns, basted quilt tops. She sold kits. She had commissioned quilts that were made that people ordered. She also offered just quilting services. And she was producer of a mail order catalog, which was called The Romance of the Village Quilt. And we can see a picture of that. That would be on the left. And that was 1936. She maintained what I call a stable of quilters, both in Wisconsin and in Kentucky. And these women had to audition to be one of Mary's quilters. And that I think is a picture, possibly, it doesn't say it's out of that catalog, but it may well be a quilter, and that may well be Mary standing behind her watching and showing them that she was looking at the quality of work. I did read an interview of a young woman who said that she wanted to be hired by Mary to quilt for her. Remember, this was Depression, and women were looking for ways that they could help support their families. And that she said she feverishly practiced her stitches to have an example to show that was of the required 10 to 12 stitches to the inch, which Mary required. And she passed the test and she was hired. So it was a feather in somebody's bonnet to be able to quilt for Mary. She woke. The shop was also well known. Many busloads of women would come to the area just to see her shop. And she got people who came all the way from all over the United States and from Canada. And we have a picture next of Mary, again with her husband. And I think this might be the possible picture of the bed that they used for the bed turnings that were offered at the shop, often when the busloads would come. And I have a memory that I would love to read to you of a gal by the name of Mary Ann Gelser-Sheevy. And she wrote this, and it gives you a real impression of what the shop was like, the quality that was there, and how well run it was. She said, and I quote, "There were 3 little girls who had the responsibility of turning the quilts when Auntie Mac had a group of ladies come through on one of their tours. I was one of the 3, and the Merwin twins were the other 2. They were the turners, and I was the smoother. I was about 8, and the twins were 10. They took their responsibility very seriously. We were to have nicely clean and pressed dresses on. Our shoes were polished, and of course, our hands and faces scrubbed shining clean. Our fingernails were to be clean and with no polish. Our hair was to be neatly combed. And usually the twins stood on either side of the bed. They were not to talk, but stand very straight and smile sweetly. Auntie Mac would give a silent nod, and the quilt would be rolled back halfway. Another nod, and the quilt would be rolled back again until it got to the end of the bed where I smoothed it. Sometimes there were as many as 15 quilts. It was very hard to keep them from falling and still keep them smooth. After the ladies left, we had to turn the quilts back very slowly so as to keep them from falling and keep them straight on the bed. It was interesting to hear all about the history of each pattern. After we were through at our job, Auntie Mac would give us enough money to go buy a soda. We were so happy that we got the call to turn the quilts." I love that.
Oh my gosh, that is so great. Twins even, but she really had every detail covered, didn't she?
Oh, I think she did. I think she knew exactly what she wanted, and she knew how she was going to get it done. So quilts were sold as far away as Europe and even to the Hollywood elite. Mary was a friend of Marie Webster's, and there's conversation, and I do have a copy of a postcard that has a conversation between the two of them. She sold Marie's patterns and quilts in a store, and if we could see the next picture, shows a picture of this interior of the store, and
let me ask, how were you aware of that inventory that she was selling to Europe and to Hollywood? Were you able to access records from the store?
Other than what has been written by some people and some information that had contact with people who worked directly at the store at one time or another, or were clients of the store.
Wow.
I do know that I had run an account that one of the quilts went to Norway. So they did go to different places. So she was very well known throughout the country, and particularly in the Middle West. If you look at that center wreath quilt, maybe about 1 o'clock of the picture, and that's a primrose wreath pattern. That's one of Marie Webster's patterns. Business arrangement was also made by a gentleman called Robert Markowitz, and he produced die-cut kits, which Mary sold as a part of her store inventory, and also fabric and thread, and were purchased through him for the shop. The next picture we can go to, that shows a picture of the Rockport and later, and later the Lockport battery companies, the wrappers that they used around their batting products, and the patterns that were supplied, as on the right-hand side, that were supplied from the quilt shop to be wrapped in the packages of the batting. And you can see in the yellow area, it says there that the pattern was provided by Mary's shop. Okay, she was also, and we'll go to the next slide, a designer of patterns. This is the Painted Daisy quilt, which is again on the right-hand side, and the one on the left is daisy chain. And it is, the small one seems to be almost a replica, and it has the same feeling as the large one. The large green one was the front piece of the catalog that she had produced in 1936. And how do we know this? Well, they closely appear to look a lot like one another. And as I said before, she always used that Peter Pan highly qualified fabrics. And we can show a close-up next of the two pieces. And actually the green one is behind me. As you can see, the quality of the workmanship, the stitching, and how close it is and how neat the workmanship is. She used solids and soft pastels many times, and she always described using eggshell, and she mentioned that in her catalog. And of the quilts, and I've probably seen through my career about 30 or 40 quilts that have a connection to this shop, and all of them use eggshell. They never use white. So if you're out looking for one of those, that's one of the telltale things. Next slide, please. And this is a close-up of the Painted Daisy, and you can see there again that excellent workmanship that was produced at that shop.
Yeah. I had never seen such amazing quilting. That's my memory of first seeing the baby quilt, was that center panel, or the center part of it, was quilted. I think it's close to 16 stitches per inch, and we count those stitches on the top. And
yes,
that is just ridiculously intense and just so beautifully done.
It is indeed. And we can go to the next slide, please. And this is from the catalog. And this, you could have quilts quilted, obviously, by her quilters. And this is the type of quilting that she offered. It was a background grid of 1/4 inch, which we saw on the last two slides. And also the larger grid was 5/8 of an inch, not the 1/2 inch that you'd normally expect. So that's another really strong clue to the quilts that came out of that shop. And then the last grid would be up to 1 inch. And we'll talk a little bit more about those parallel lines because they show up in these quilts repeatedly also. There were specific quilting motifs that will often show up in the quilts. There were feathers, there were wreaths and hearts that were repeated from quilt to quilt. Okay, the next slide. There you can see 5/8 of an inch. Wow. And they were all that way. And your baby quilt is that way also.
And just so perfectly even and beautifully stitched.
Absolutely. Okay, next picture. Okay, this is a sibling of the Painted Daisy. It is in my possession, and it too is a design that I feel strongly it was from Mary herself. It resembles and seems to be a sibling of the pink one that I want so badly from your museum that you won't let me have. But it shows again that workmanship. And again, that's the 5/8 inch grid and the parallel lines that I briefly mentioned on that previous drawing, the double parallel lines, and they show up both in the pink baby quilt that you have and in this particular blue quilt. It is from a pattern, and we can go to the next slide. And that's on the right-hand side, called Quaker Brides. Wow. And it says in small print on the top that the design is by Mary McElwain. So we know that now that this is also one of the designs that she herself had done, plus also the daisy chain quilt, which appeared on the front of her catalog. The characteristics of the two together. We can take the next slide, please. Okay, this is a close-up of one of those paper patterns, and this is actually from the Quaker brides. And this is what often came, this very thin tissue type wrapper that came along with the batting that gave you what you needed to have to be able to make that particular quilt. Okay, we'll go to the next picture. And it tells you what you receive in your quilt. There's 9 yards of eggshell, 3 yards of greens for the bands, the leaves, and the binding. And I think one is maybe a 1/4 yard for the butterflies for this and for stemming. And that says 12 yards. I'm not exactly sure about that. And then a yard each of 3 different pieces of colors of fabric that you needed to complete the quilt. Okay, next.
So these are a little bit different than, or did she also send, because I'm familiar with the kits that come in the package and you've got the backing all marked for you and the pieces are outlined and you just cut them out. So would you consider this more of a pattern, but she just supplied the fabrics then?
We don't know, but I do know that the daisies are very similar between the large and the small version of that daisy quilt, and that the 5-petal flower on the Blue Baby quilt and on the Quaker Brides is the same flower, just a little different scale. So I've wondered if these two, since they do not show up in the catalog, if they were designed later, or perhaps they were commission work that people asked, can you make a baby quilt of this pattern? This is what I need. And these two ended up to be the end result of that. Have you seen any more in this pattern as a baby quilt?
No.
No.
And I'm just looking at how difficult it would be to create that balanced circle and to keep that circle so perfect. You know, it just seems like if you were, well, I think this is the case with many quilts, especially kits, because we have kits where someone opened it up and they applicate about 3 pieces and they said, that's it, and they put it back in the wrapper. But I do think, you know, these are so exact and so beautifully constructed. And sometimes I do wonder, you know, was there somebody at the shop that was making this quilt? We don't have any information on our baby quilt. So maybe it was one they made, because this takes a lot of skill, these designs. This is not an easy applique pattern to create if you didn't have much for instructions.
Well, she does say that you could order a completed quilt, or you could order a top quilted yourself, or you could order the kit and take it home, do the applique and the work that was required to make the top, and then send it back for the quilting. So there were a lot of options.
Any one of those.
So we don't know for sure about either of these, but I suspect that both of them were made by quilters from her shop. That certainly as far as the quilting is concerned,
they are so. The workmanship is so stellar. You just kind of wonder. It had to. I mean, this is not somebody who had not made other quilts, because they laid perfectly flat. The circle. I mean, anytime as somebody who cannot really piece worth a darn, and I like to applique, but I still struggle to get that balance, and these are perfectly done. So I feel like somebody would be pretty skilled.
I think that on an average, most women can quilt, especially today with the materials we have. That I've heard and I have read that somewhere between around 8 stitches per inch is what we're able to accomplish today.
Mm-hmm.
Now, both of these have very thin batting in them, so I don't know if the battings were split or if this was something that was especially available to them, or it was something that Mary particularly ordered from her batting companies to be able to allow people to get this type of stitching.
I do think that really thin batting is definitely a key to getting those tiny, tiny stitches. You know, you see that in the 19th century quilts when they were doing this kind of extravagant quilting, they were using such a thin cotton batting. So I think that definitely helps.
I think they knew what to do to get those beautiful stitches that they could kind of brag a little bit about.
I think so too. Yes.
Absolutely. But the characteristics of this, so we'll see that the Quaker Bride quilt has the same 5-petal flowers as does the Quaker Bride quilt, the larger version of it. And both these have that similar medallion type style as the big counterpart or the large counterpart has. Same quality fabrics that Mary advocated. This quilt, the one I have, the blue one, is a little bit larger than the one you have. And that kind of makes me think again that perhaps it was a commission piece, because this one is 34.5 by 48, where the other one I believe was 27 by maybe 36. So there's certainly a difference. Yours is teeny tiny for sure, and certainly meant maybe for a newborn or for a christening. Same motifs in the same place as the daisy chain. And if we could go to the next slide, we can see some of those motifs. Now you see the heart that is in both quilts. It's the same heart.
Oh, yeah, it is.
And there again are the grids that we see, the 1/4 inch grid and the 5/8 inch grid that are on both of these. Quilting stitches on the blue one is 15 to 16 stitches per inch. And certainly that was the hallmark of that shop. And both of them have the same broken diagonal lines on them. So they are both two absolutely fabulous pieces. And I still want the pink one from you guys.
If only it wasn't a crime to come steal it.
So. And here we can show the diagonal lines between the two quilts, which was one of the designs that Mary advocated. And it gives us a sense of what that was all about, and how the line was on the pink one is extended from the grid, so it is not an unbroken characteristic. Right follows through, so that there's continuity between the quilt center and the first border.
I think that, again, that's a professional taking those kind of details into consideration. That's somebody who really is thinking about how they're doing that, because she started those diagonal lines down the side, and there's one that doesn't match up, but then she just went right back and got it right on that that line of stitching. Wow.
Wouldn't you love to be able to, and maybe we'll get that opportunity in our next life, to be able to talk to these women and what it was like, and how they were able to do this, and what it was all about.
Wouldn't you though? Yeah. Wow. I wonder what they'd say about Mary McElwain, though. I wonder if she'd say that she was a easy person to work with, or if they would say she was very particular. I think they'd say she's very particular. So
I think I would lend on that side also, but it amazes me that she was able to do all the things that she was able to do, and run this business at a time that was during the Depression, when the money was tight. And to be able to make it such a success, I think it's just outstanding.
This is a question, and we have an exhibition coming up that Janniken Smucker, who is a professor at a university in Philadelphia now and graduated from our program. It's called A New Deal for Quilts, and she's really looking back at the Depression and the Works Progress Administration and how they encourage people to do these home crafts. But Mary McElwain was doing that before the Depression. Marie Webster was doing that. I am just so intrigued with this time period, and the fact that quilting was on an increase even at a time when people didn't have a lot to spend, and that it continued to grow. And I don't know, do you have any philosophies about why you think that would have happened? Because it seems like at that point you would be kind of pulling back and not having time to create.
I think that, but I think because of the weight of the period of time on families and what struggles they may have had, and I think that even goes up into World War II with the rationing, etc., that women sometimes had to have an outlet, had to have something beautiful, had to have something that was enduring, that would help them get through sometimes the difficult periods in their lives.
That's a very good point. Yeah. It is fascinating. And I they obviously, I think it may have something also to do with the fact that in essence, a quilt is still functional. So we're making something useful, even though some of these quilts, like the baby quilt, has a tiny little stain on it here, but it really doesn't look like they were used. So they were still making these quilts that really were just for their own sake and for their own mental health, I think.
Absolutely. I see we have a question.
Yes, so this is what we're counting stitches. When we do that at the museum, and I assume you're kind of following that same lead because we wanted to compare quilting stitches, we count just the quilts that are on this surface, the top surface of the quilt. So that, you're rocking through that. You do have the opposite stitch on the back, but we're talking about 16 stitches on the top per inch. It is amazing.
I will add to that I go back to my days of knitting when I count stitches on the top of the quilt. And when I learned in knitting that you count the stitches over a 2-inch period length and then divide. So you might, end up with a half a stitch with something, certainly can happen. But so if you get 16 stitches in 2 inches, then it would be 8 stitches to the inch. That would probably be a little bit closer. Yeah, because there are variances.
Yeah, and we always try to do to count in different places on the quilt and then do an average of 3 different counts. Sometimes you can really see that maybe there was more than one hand working on a quilt because you see such a difference in just the way the stitches are created, the way they're super straight. Typically when you're looking at quilting, you can see kind of that first stitch will have just a little bit of an angle to it when they're starting to rock their needle. But that's why I really wonder if these quilts weren't made at the shop, because you don't see that. You don't see evidence of like that personal touch. What you see is something that a professional was doing that was just of the highest quality.
Absolutely. And as we know, she auditioned people to get the best of the best to be able to come to work for her. Certainly.
She would not have hired me. If I could get 8 stitches per inch, I'm pretty excited. So, Carol, we have a question. Can you tell us again the years that Mary's shop was in business?
She started as a back corner of her husband's, I believe, jewelry shop that she had a small area where she sold kind of knick-knacky type of things and dolls. She was very interested in collecting dolls, and I understand she had way over 300 dolls in her personal collection. And she did continue to sell some of that when she had the quilt shop, but it grew from that. And then when he retired from the jewelry business, then she took over the complete store. And eventually they even added on to the store and made it even larger so that they could accommodate, especially the busloads of people that came in.
Can you imagine busloads? And you said that then the shop stayed open even after she wasn't working there in
Yes.
43?
She passed away in 1943, and her daughter and I imagine other family members kept the store open, finally closing it in 1960.
Wow. So Lisa asked, what's the highest number of quilting stitches per inch that we've seen at the museum, hand stitches? I would say 16 is way up there. If we saw one that had a few more than that, I'd be kind of astounded. I think that in the early 19th century, again, when professionals were making quilts, I think we see some that are comparable, but 16 is outrageous, just outrageous. And it is, the texture that it creates is so stunningly beautiful. And that's what I love about the center of these quilts. And I can even see it over your shoulder, Carol, how it just creates like it's almost like it's a different type of fabric than the outer edges where you don't see the quilting packed in as tightly. It just creates such a different look to it. That's what I remember about this baby quilt so much. The first time I saw it was that center medallion was so thickly quilted, and that grid was so tightly packed that I've always just loved the texture that you get from hand quilting, and that was just so stunningly beautiful.
Absolutely. And I recall seeing one quilt at a museum in Milwaukee. It was a white on white years and years ago. That made me hyperventilate because it was 20 stitches to the ends. But that's the most I've ever seen. That was just unbelievable. So
Yeah, you kind of wonder if they're even then doing kind of a stab stitch up and down, because it would be so hard to get that rocking. But then if you practice and you're an expert, then I guess that's what you can do. But
I don't really think they had to rock, because you can tell from stab stitch when you turn it over and look at the back of the quilt that they just don't line up with the stab stitch. So you can pick that out pretty easily, and you don't see that on these quilts.
They're amazing. And Carol, you said you'd seen, how many quilts that you've seen that are all from McElwain Studio or McElwain Patterns?
That have had a connection to them, I would say between 30 and 40.
Wow.
During my appraisal career that have come across my table. And I own another one, which is what she called, it's Drunkard's Path pattern, but she called it Gypsy Tears. And I think she was trying to stay away from during the Depression and the prohibition on liquor to stay away from Drunkard's Path if she was going to sell something. So it was called Gypsy Tears, and it is a 2-color quilt, and it's the same eggshell and more of a rose-colored fabric. Has the same feather designs, has the same grids. It's very, very similar.
So did she do many that were more of a piece design versus applique?
If you look at her catalog, there are, because remember, she had Robert Markowitz, who provided dies for her to assemble kits. So there are many piece designs in her catalog also, log cabin type things. Off the top of my head, I can probably flip open the book and see her as we have it right in front of me. She had what she called American tapestry, which is like a grandmother's dream. She also did another kit where it was a double Irish chain that had a applique border. So those were, and I do know that the double Irish chain was from Markowitz's dies that she had assembled. I had also read that she had a lady who was specifically assigned to take some of the designs of the older quilt designs, the designs from the 1800s, and assemble them into kits and do the workmanship, et cetera, to get that situated so that they could offer a pattern in a kit. So, she was covering all her bases.
She was. Well, it was so interesting. When I first started at the museum, I'll never forget, Virginia Gunn came to the museum, and I don't remember what the project she was working on was. I think it was when she was teaching classes for us, and we'd have her look at quilts, and she would say, well, you know that this is not a 19th century quilt. This is a 20th century kit or die cut pattern that was sold. And she was so knowledgeable that she could take a look, and she would look at things like the overall design, the quilting design, the size of the quilt, the way it was bound. She would look at all of those details, and she really changed what we knew about the quilts in our collection, because we had not had an expert that had looked at them, and we certainly weren't experts at the time, but Virginia could really spot that. And that's when we really were kind of like, wow, we have a really strong kit and pattern collection that I don't think the Jameses were aware that they were collecting that. They definitely knew some of the major ones, the Marie Websters and Ann Orr. Some of those big names came with the quilts. But there are a lot of quilts in the collection that when you look at them now and you compare after seeing a lot of quilts, you can see the difference in the colors and in the style. But at the time, we didn't know at all. And so many of them they're kind of that imitation of the 19th century piece.
Yes, absolutely. And thank goodness for Rosie Werner to take and do the research on the patterns, because it's been a wonderful resource, I think, for we appraisers to find out more about the quilts and kind of zero in, the style, who perhaps the designer was, the period of time, using her website, which is a subscription website, but is a wonderful resource.
It's an invaluable resource. She's been really great about letting us use that, and we're hoping at some point to help her house that so that we don't lose all that information. She has done an amazing job.
And she continues to. Yeah, I know she said she's added some things recently. And if I see something as an appraiser that I don't see on her website, I send her what information I have on it, and then she can add it to her databases. So it's helpful to all of us to be able to do that and share with one another.
It is. So Molly was asking if the quilting pattern carried on to the applique pieces, and it doesn't appear, as we were looking at these slides, that she quilts over the applique.
I agree too, and I had read in one of Ricky Clark's books regarding Ohio quilts that the idea of quilting across the applique seems to be a very Ohio thing, and shows up in quilts from that particular area. So it's not here. And in that double Irish chain quilt, which has a scallop border, it's not quilted across the appliques in that particular one either. So those are the two that come immediately to mind when I think about it. Or the daisy behind me, for that matter, is not quilted across the appliques.
It'd be really hard to get those tiny stitches over those layers.
Absolutely. They're smart enough to figure that one out for sure. But again, that 1/4-inch grid is like a stippling. It is so tiny.
It is. It's like stippling. That's a great way to describe it, because it's so intense, and it does. It gives the fabric such a different feel and look. You know, the other thing that I've been really intrigued by, Carol, is, and I've been having this conversation with a number of people lately, because we were talking about the donation offers we get. And I'm sure you've seen this through your appraisals, where what we tend to see are the 20th century quilts, often from the 1930 or 20 to 40 period, maybe is a range that we look at. And they tend to be Midwestern. And I think so we were having this conversation, and maybe it was even on the last Quiltside chats, I'm not sure, about how it seems like quilting really took off in the Midwest in that period from 20 to 40, and maybe declined on the East Coast. Do you feel like, in what you've seen, that would stand up?
I think so too, and I've thought about that same idea, and I haven't done certainly any research, and have had thoughts about that. I don't know. It was because most of these were, a lot of the Midwest was farming, and if this was something that they latched on through women's groups or something, but it became so widespread in the Midwest compared to some of the other areas in the country. And I'm not really sure why. What are your thoughts on it, Carolyn?
Well, what I find so intriguing, there's a couple things. I find it so intriguing that women did patterns that were very complex, like the kits, like double wedding ring, like grandmother's flower garden. There were certainly people who were making more standard piece quilts, but I do feel like it was it had just come to the Midwest, and people were making, they really, it caught on here at a different time than it did on the East Coast. And that makes a lot of sense, because obviously the early quilts, Nebraska wasn't even a state until 1860. So we weren't doing early quilts. But I just think that there was something about this period, and I do think it might have been, like you said, we know that these rural areas start getting the rural mail carriers developed, and so then you would get the catalogs, and you could get your patterns, and you could send for things, and so that may have had a lot to do with it. But it just seems like, I guess, crazy quilts come to us. That's another quilt we see a lot of. They survive because they weren't washed, and those may have been a greater national trend. But I feel like after the crazy quilt, after the turn of the century, things quiet a bit, and then they spring up again, probably with these patterns, but probably, with the shops and the kits, but probably because of publications, and because people could access patterns and mail order then.
I think to add to that was that when we get into after World War one that had access to these more pastel fabrics and quality fabrics that were coming from the mills. And this was something, interesting, exciting, and different than the deep darks of the
You're right.
previous
Yes.
quarter century. And I think this was new and exciting. And that's really when we see such a heavy weight of grandmother's flower garden quilts and double wedding ring quilts and Dresden plate quilts, that those patterns became so popular, and especially in the Midwest, because we had these lovely, lovely fabrics that were bright and cheery and could certainly change the flavor of a home, perhaps during the Depression in those years when things were not necessarily the best, and give a little light to the whole situation.
Yeah, people may not realize that one of the reparations from World War I is that the United States got the dye recipes from the German dyers who were
Right.
such experts, and that is when our whole palette completely changed. I think you're right. I think that, I mean, just the beauty and the cheerfulness of the fabrics was probably something that really encouraged people to make quilts, just because they were so lovely to work with.
I'm sure you know, but I believe it was that the United States did not settle with Germany after World War I until there, and I can't remember the name of the extension after the Versailles Agreement that allowed us to get those patterns, and that was in 1921. I do know that, but I can't remember what it was. Knowlton. I can't remember the name of that particular
I
piece.
think
Can
that,
you?
yeah, that's such a big part of it, I'm sure. The other thing that I've been really, I've just all of a sudden found myself in the middle of, because I'm working with a couple of acquisitions and a couple different scholars, is looking at this whole idea of the Midwest, and especially in your area. So Chicago, Detroit, Indiana, Wisconsin. It was just a hotbed of these women who owned shops and were creating patterns. And um, we have the Mary Gaspert collection. She was showing both in Michigan and in Detroit in the newspapers. I mean, it just seemed like quilting then just kind of caught people's imagination and just swept through the Midwest in such a unique way. And I'm sure that these shop owners who were putting out these kits and patterns were just a huge part of that.
That, and also the Kansas City Star and the other various newspapers, the Chicago papers that had women in the women's arts section of their paper, and how they could order patterns through them, how they gave advice columns, and just conversation groups of women together that they could all enter into. It just kind of made it like a whole Midwestern, if not further, club of women that could share things with one another.
It's kind of an interesting kind of a regional thing in a way. We see so much in regional styles, and I think that's one of the really interesting things that have come out of the amazing research that individuals have been doing, especially through AQSG in the last 25 years, that people have been able to really gather lots of images from different collections and see these regions. California had the art quilts much later in the century, but I just feel like the Midwest. And then when you think about like the 1933 Century Progress Contest, it just makes perfect sense, because of course there were so many people that were quilting, and a lot of women who were opening shops and doing all of these different kind of items, from selling patterns to actually making the quilt. And that makes that Century Progress Contest make so much sense, because it was the heart of that area.
Yeah, exactly. What that brought forward, and Mary Kay Wallvogel's great research on all of that has just made this just exploded what was going on here that perhaps was not given that much attention previously. And again, we have all that thing, well, it's women's work, but they were making beautiful things.
Yes, they were. And obviously women were getting so involved in it. I am just always, another thing that I just find so fascinating is how much women follow fashion. And we can see that in our quilts from the 1600s, which there's not too many of them, but there were trends. There were enough quilts out there that someone was creating quilts even that early for people who desired them and I don't know, did you order one? Did you send your ship's captain to find you one? I don't know. But throughout history, people weren't working in a vacuum ever. They were working together. They were looking at what their neighbors were doing. They were working as a team to finish quilts. So there were just these strong trends that occurred that, you know, when we do our quilt identification days where people can bring in their quilts and we'll tell them about that, they'll say, how can you know, or even give me, say, a 20-year range? How do you know? And I say, well, it's because the trends are so distinctive.
Yes.
Now, I will say, and as an appraiser, I bet you really encounter this a lot, that there are always exceptions to those rules. There is no hard and fast rule that I haven't seen broken.
Well, I'm still using some fabric that's 20, 25 years old.
Exactly.
Incorporating in the quilt. So you see them oftentimes that they're have quilts fabrics in them. They may expand even beyond 20, 30 years and they'll all be in the same quilt. It's always interesting. And I think also what was going on in technology and what was going on in the economy and the depressions that were happening at certain periods through the 18th and into the 19th and the 20th centuries, that all that had an effect on what was happening down the road as far as the fabrics that were available and what was being made available to women that they had to work with.
You know, I absolutely agree with you. I just said that to somebody, that when you look at developments in quilting, look for the technology behind it, because it's so often driven by a new development, whether it's the dye developments or machinery, die cut machines. All of it is driven very much by what was, I mean, the technology and the quilts go hand in hand.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and the publication. Yeah, and honestly, I love that you talked about the Peter Pan fabric, because we have seen that in the Mountain Mist collection, and that was a little bit broader company than many of these smaller, more regional shops, but they use the Peter Pan quilts. And then the Rainbow Company is a collection we just got recently. We saved all their paper patterns and photographed them all. Sharon Pinka is reviving her paper on the Rainbow Company as we speak. She came and really looked at what we had, and we couldn't keep all the papers because they were on those thin, that thin paper you showed, and they were falling apart and paper rots. And so we did high-res images of thousands of rainbow patterns. And then it's tucked in among the patterns were a few quilts and a lot of the Peter Pan fabric samples that they used, and they must have had quite a monopoly on the market, because it seems like if you were wanting quality cotton, that was your go-to manufacturer.
And I think cloth of gold was another one that was a high quality cotton that was utilized. But as you agree, you can recognize that Peter Pan fabric when you've seen enough of it.
It's so tightly woven and it's almost a sateen effect, I think, because it's so beautifully printed and so vibrant.
And the colors are the pastel color palette that many of them use. They did other things, obviously, also, but I think they're very recognizable when you've seen quite a few of them. So.
Well, I have one more kind of unrelated question for you, Carolyn. I'm so interested to ask you as an appraiser, because I think we're seeing such a change in the market. What are you seeing these days? Are prices up? Are certain prices up? What are you experiencing?
I see the market is depressed, but I have seen through some of the women's magazines that they're showing some quilts again. And, you know, we have the farmhouse designs in architecture, and those are calling again for some quilts. So there might be a change. You know, it's an up and down thing. It's just a thing that keeps on moving. There was Lean Bassett just posted on Facebook a Baltimore album quilt, which we know is the top of the line of the beautiful old quilts that we see. That one that's sold, and I don't have it in front of me, was originally sold for $100,000, and when it exchanged hands, it went down to $59,000 and they were both sold through either Christie's or Sotheby's. And it was just recently resold, and it sold for 19,000. So that gives an indication of where the market has been. Although I think the upper scale quilts have more held their value than the average quilts that we probably see so many replicas over and over again, and maybe not the best of condition. Condition is always the thing that's most important, as it would be in any kind of an antique or any type of a collectible condition like location. So
right. Yeah, it is really fascinating. The other thing that I think that is so intriguing that's happening right now is the just enormous number of quilts that we see that are at auction right now. So if you wanted to put together a nice collection of quilts that typically don't have provenance and might have a couple of condition issues, it seems like right now you could really easily pull together an amazing collection by looking at all the different auctions. And I'm talking about quilts selling, $25, $35, $50. It's kind of sad.
Yes, it is, and it too will change, as it always does. I was just looking at a couple of the Better Homes and Gardens issues regarding the antique plates and dishes, etc., and they've been introducing them into place setting groupings using various dishes, and then pulling out some of those old vintage patterns that our mothers and our grandmothers had from their dinner services that young women maybe are not using so often anymore, but showing these beautiful place settings and table settings, and they're using the old plates. So there might be a revived interest in that, and things may change again. Who knows where it'll be another 10 years from now.
It does. It just goes back and forth and around and changes, and that's why we rely on appraisers like you, Carol, because you really do have to keep your eye to the market and how it changes so much constantly. And things seemed really down to me since 2008, especially. But yeah, I don't think Baltimore albums, even the top ones, I think they sold really expensively early on because we didn't know how many there were. But do you think it's just not a market that's out there buying them that causes it to come down, or do you think? It's just interesting to see if people will be collecting quilts in the same way.
Maybe not in the same way, but the thing is, what's it going to be like now that all the quilts that we are making now hit the market? There's not going to. I wonder how little of a market there's going to be for them, because the market will be saturated. And I get clients all the time asking me, I have moms and grandmas quilts, the kids don't want them. Where can I sell them? What can I do?
Oh yeah, we get donations every single day, and honestly, we're trying so hard to stay to provenance is such a big deal, and condition and rarity, all those things. And what we see are kind of the similar quilts coming through really regularly. And it's kind of sad because I don't know what to tell. We always give people a list, here's where else you can go, but there's not a lot of great options for quilts to end up, there's just not enough museums. A lot of quilts aren't museum quality, so they are just circling back through a whole different audience in a different way now.
Well, we have one slide that I would like to bring up. It's the very last slide, because I think there's some acknowledgments here that are important. Please, Pat Nichols did a fabulous job on Uncoverings, which is the writings of the American Quilt Study Group, and from 1991, and she did a whole wonderful research program on Mary McElwain. And I did some work that I contributed as part of the consideration for the Quilters Hall of Fame, of which Mary has been in a part of now and have been accepted to. And also there's a wonderful little article, not little, it's quite lengthy, Mary McElwain Road Trip, which is by Anna Harkins. And you can find that there too. I think those are all important things that you may want for further reading.
Absolutely. Well, and just like that, our hour is up, Carol. Oh my gosh, we could have talked all afternoon. It's such an interesting topic, and there's just so many questions I could ask, but we're so pleased that you're here today, Carol. Thank you for sharing your expertise and sharing your quilts, and such beautiful summer quilts. They're just perfect for our June meeting. Our next Quiltside chats will be in September, and we will be chatting with Marion Ann Montgomery, who is at the Texas Tech Museum. And we may, I have down September 17th, and I didn't check and see if Lisa gave me a different date. I will be traveling then, so do keep an eye out. And I can't get my email open, but do keep an eye out for the next Quiltside chats in September. And we will be, I think, talking some feet sack quilts maybe with Marion Ann. I'm not sure. So
thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Carol. And thanks everybody for watching today. And we'll look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.